and welcome to another lesson with me, James Teacher. Today we're going to talk about the concept of feudalism. Now on YouTube there are some excellent videos on this topic and they present some more information. And so I would like for you to look at those videos which will offer some more visual information on the concept of feudalism. And so I will talk about it in a very basic way today. And if we have a class period together anytime this year, then I will cover this with you in a different format. It's important to understand what feudalism is because it is the way that society or the people were able to organize themselves and get work done in the past. Feudalism was actually a very good thing for people because it helped divide up the labor, the work to be done, and it actually produced more food and longer lives for those people who were in the system. One of the first things that we need to know is that feudalism was basically like a triangle. Feudalism was organized from a very small top to a very broad or very large bottom. At the very top of the feudal system was the king. The king ruled a large area of land called a domain or a kingdom. And the king was not always alone in his decision-making process. He had scribes, or people who write down information for him. He had attendants who dressed him and who would take care of his personal needs, such as cooking, or even would help him bathe, get clean in the morning or the evening, and again would dress him in the morning and dress him before he went to bed. So the king had many different servants, but the king was basically the leader. He was the top decision maker, and he kept the feudal system organized and operating. Under the king were a group of people called the nobles. Now, what a noble was, there are two different ways to think of a noble. A nobleman was not a person who was just kind or good-natured or something like that. A nobleman was restricted to those who could carry a sword and were born by people or born from people who were already a part of the feudal system and had a relationship to the king. Generally, nobles did have more money and they had more ability to do things that the lower classes, the knights and the serfs, could not. The nobles were responsible to watch after and look after the king's lands. So here in Mongolia and in many countries, you have the country and you have what are called provinces. And the nobles were basically the provincial leaders for the king. They had control of a smaller part of the kingdom and the king's lands. This meant that the nobles were able to collect and gather the necessary food and resources that people needed and give them to the king. Underneath the nobles, there was a larger group of people, again, keeping with our pyramid, called the knights. A knight was basically the soldier of the medieval period. The knights were only responsible for one thing: fighting, going to war. From early in the morning until late at night, the knight was always ready and prepared to go and fight for the nobles. And the nobles were required to bring a certain number of knights with them if the king went to war with another king. We see in history that there were many knights, often at battles, but there were other fighters. There were men who were archers or bowmen. There were men who operated machines to break down walls and to hurl giant rocks and stones at castle buildings. So each of these noblemen were required. Basically, the government said you must bring with you a certain number of soldiers to every fight. Now, a noble could fight with another noble, even one under the same king. And this did lead to many different fights. In fact, fighting between nobles became so common and to such a problem that the Christian church had to say on what days you could and could not fight. They had to sign a document that said, I will not fight on Wednesdays, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And so this became a tradition that you would not fight on these days. Basically, the church was saying, let's take a break from violence. So the church did a wonderful thing for many different people. Underneath the knights was the largest number of people. Again, keeping with a pyramid, and we're now at the bottom of the pyramid. The serfs were required to do only one job. As everyone did one job, the king did one job, the nobles did one job, the knights did one job, and the serfs were going to do one job, and that is produce food. They produced food for themselves, but also for the knights, the nobles, and the king. So they would grow their crops, and they would take a small amount for themselves. They would also raise horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, other types of animals, and they could take a small portion of these for themselves in order to survive and to continue living and continue farming. But the majority of their food was transferred upwards to the knights, and the knights gave to the nobles, and the nobles gave to the king. Why is that? Well, that's because wealth was not measured as we measure it today. The kings did not measure wealth through money. What they measured wealth through was land and the ability to feed themselves food. So wheat, animals, all of these other items were the king's main source of wealth and prosperity. In fact, money was such a non-measure of wealth that what the kings did was they introduced what was called the tally stick. And it could be a stick like this. And a commissioner or a man of the king or the noble would come and he would look at your farm and he would look at your personal wealth and he would make a certain number of notches on that stick to represent how much you personally had, such as how many cows, how many horses and sheep that you are taking for yourself. And they would take these tally sticks all throughout the country and bring them and deposit them with the king. So this was a very different time. I want to say very specifically, you may see pictures of kings with great crowns or very elaborate dress. Kings did not dress this way every day. Many kings only wore the crown and the very fine clothing one day a year or during special occasions. The rest of the time, they wore what we would call street clothing or casual dress all day long. So it was only when they felt that they needed to make a very strong impression on their friends or especially their enemies that they would dress with the royal crown. Other times they would have a very simple band on their head with no jewels inside. That crown was specially located in a safe in order to keep that part of their wealth very well protected. Thank you.